Hi, welcome to the Public Voice Salon. My name is John Braden. We are an open dialogue on education, the arts, and social change. Not necessarily in that order, I like to say. And we are here with a very interesting man. I would say in my lifetime, there's very few geniuses that I've actually met. This man qualifies as a genius. He is a philosopher. He is an incredible conversationalist. He is a playwright, an actor. He is also an educator and a molecular biologist. He's all of these things. And we are in his Murray Hill apartment in Manhattan. He's just coming off an amazing run at the Beckett Theater in a play called Phalaris's Bull, Solving the Riddle of the Great Big World, which got an incredible review in the New Yorker and in New York Magazine and in the Times. And we are here, and he's getting all kinds of offers now from to make a movie out of it and for a reality television show possibility. And so we are just feel very lucky to be here with Steven for the whole hour on his couch with this abstract work of art behind us here.
I am an artist, but that is not an example of my art. This actually is an example of my art, if you can see that. I do acrylic rods painted in the reverse in individual brushstrokes, and you look through the pole to the images. But, so not that. Yes, in fact, that's something I didn't say earlier, that each image that you see is achieved by one brushstroke. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 images, 7 brushstrokes.
The thing that I'm most impressed with now by being in your presence for maybe about a half hour or so is how wonderfully alive you are to the world and to express yourself with ideas and with thoughts and conversation. And how did that talk about that aspect of your life? Were you always so extroverted, or is that something new?
Never extroverted. In fact, in college, when there have been times when people that I've known in recent years have encountered college roommates of mine, and they've asked for a characterization of how I was in college. And one of my roommates not too long ago told somebody, unpleasant. He was basically, because I had very little interest in the human environment. I was focused on reading. Books were my passion. I mean, it was said when we were the first week in college, we were given a series of orientation lectures, and one of the lectures stressed that college professors were accessible, but in general, they were more comfortable with books than with people. So always keep that in mind. Don't feel frustrated or feel that they're rejecting your overtures. They're just not so comfortable. Well, that largely was, I think, how I was. Not to the degree that maybe I was uncomfortable, not like painfully shy. That wouldn't characterize me, but just not fundamentally interested at that time. I was interested in what Plato had written, or what Kierkegaard had written, or what Wittgenstein had written. I was interested in the finished form, of these people's works, where I felt, whatever interest and magnetism their personality might have had, there was an even greater sort of presence in the actual art or literature or philosophy or science they had produced.
So you were kind of home reading. You were like the bookish kid. You weren't out there playing baseball or stuff.
I was an only child, and I was accustomed to entertaining myself. I was accustomed to playing games by myself. Bobby Fischer used to say that he would play, chess against himself. That's what I did. I would play chess with myself. I would play Monopoly with myself. I would invent games, out of at the time the equivalent of Lego before there was Lego, little bricks. I'd just create all kinds of imaginary worlds. But no, my interest was early on books. And I think I say in the play that one of the things, there's a line, my parents bought me books. And that's about, as sort of as axial a line for the early part of my life as there might be. And I even remember reading, like, Samuel Johnson is a figure we've talked about. At one point, Samuel Johnson in his life told somebody, when you're young, read. Because when you're older, you're not going to be inclined to read so much. Well, I took that advice seriously. And it happened to be my passion. So, when I was an only child with my parents, and what
did they do, your parents?
My father worked for his father, my grandfather, who had a dress business in Manhattan. And that's also in the play. I say, in Manhattan, not far from here, not far from the Beckett Theater. In fact, when I was doing the play, I was staying on 7th Avenue, which is I think it's called Fashion Avenue.
The Garment District.
In the Garment District. And even though I was very young when I left New York, I remember, like, conversations where 7th Avenue would come up. So, I was living, doing the play in the general vicinity of where my grandfather had worked for decades in a dress business, and my father had worked, and eventually, I think I told, again, it's in the play, my father got restless, wanted to move to California, moved to Los Angeles, they sold the business and moved out there. But my father continued to work in the garment industry. Where
are your parents from originally? Were they from Europe or here?
He was from New York. His parents were from Russia, actually. My grandmother, who came to this country, I think in 1895, had a Russian passport. And that she showed me one day. So she was from, like, a little village, the kind of villages you might see in Fiddler on the Roof.
Right.
Okay, a little village in
Or Tolstoy.
Or Tolstoy, yeah. And my grandfather, actually, was a distant cousin, like a 6th cousin of my grandmother. Because, it was relatively sort of small, isolated communities. So they were both from Russia. My mother's parents were distantly from Europe, Eastern Europe. I don't know the details, actually, of their lineage, but then they moved at some earlier point to England. My mother was English, actually. And had this amalgam of an English-American accent that was influential in my growing up, because it kind of made me sensitive to just the quality of a voice, the tone and the mood and the emotionality of a voice. In fact, there's a story I tell, let me tell, that literature has become important to me, and writing has become important, and poetry has become important. That's one of my media, one of the things that I work with in poetry. But when I was younger, I was reading not literature, but science. And early on, math and science, until I was maybe 10, 11, 12, those years. And then at 12, and again I tell the story in the play, I encountered a book that I thought was science but turned out to be philosophy. Alfred North Whitehead was a mathematician, scientist, philosopher. Yeah. He wrote this book, Science in the Modern World, that I picked up in a bookstore one day, and I thought it was more science, but it turned out to be fairly detailed, difficult philosophy that affected my it was my first introduction to the subject.
How old were you then?
I was 12. And it galvanized my interest immediately. Up until that point, I was sort of part of the Sputnik generation, where people were being channeled into the sciences, and I was a math science kind of person. But from that point on, I began to transition into philosophy. And I remember the second book I read, also in a bookstore, was Albert Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus.
Pushing that rock up a hill.
Yes, exactly. And that was compelling to me. And I read that almost entirely in the bookstore. I stood in the bookstore reading the book. I was, like, completely taken by it.
And how old were you when that happened?
That was, like, around 13 or so. Yeah.
And this was California now.
No,
this was still New York. When did you?
California.
Okay.
When I was around that time, 12-ish, even though I just encountered a glimmer of philosophy, still science was my orientation. And a cousin of mine had gone to the Bronx High School of Science in New York. Yeah. He was one of these people who was very precocious. When he was young, he blew up his garage, doing a chemical experiment, which you kind of have to do if you're, like, a serious, scientist in training, right? So I somehow, and my dream in those days was Caltech. And my professional ambition was theoretical physicist, because I had started to read a lot of Einstein, and theoretical physics was, like, the field that was almost certain I was going to devote myself to. Okay, so I saw myself going to Caltech, studying and eventually working in theoretical physics, and Bronx High School of Science, presented itself as like a stepping stone in that direction. So we came to, my parents were...
Just to let you know, my grandmother went to Walton. My grandmother went to Walton High in the Bronx. That's that was the high school for women in the Bronx.
Oh, really?
And then you had DeWitt Clinton, was where the boys went, right? Okay. And now Bronx Science, of course, was for the scientifically oriented.
Yes. Okay. So we
got some Bronx background here.
Bronx background. In fact, that's why I became a Yankee fan. My father, embedded me with that before I even knew what baseball was.
What were you like in high school? Were you a popular kid or were you a nerd?
I was never a nerd. Okay. I was never seen that way. I was never teased at any point in my education, ever. I remember, I wasn't athletic, really. I mean, I was a little bit athletic for a period. It's in the play where I went to summer camp at one point and got this award for best athlete. But it wasn't, my focus or my passion, and it wasn't large, so I wasn't really competitive, in a sport like football, for example. But I was actually pretty good at baseball because I had good hand-eye coordination. I'm an artist, and that seems to, go a little bit with that territory. So I had some skills, but not really a passion, for that. But I wasn't like involved in, like groups. Like I certainly wasn't a jock.
So you were kind of an outsider, would you say, like a nonconformist?
I was accepted, by different groups. So I remember having a...
one foot in, one foot out.
Exactly. I remember, like in gym one time, sitting with, just happened to be sitting next to a guy who was a really good athlete, and we just started having a conversation, and we started having a conversation about music. And I was interested in like classical, and he was interested in kind of more popular music, but he also had some interest in classical, and so that it was always easy for me to kind of...
That was a big moment for you because this guy was cool, and when you're in high school, everybody knows who's cool, who's not. The pecking order is so intense, and when you're like moving up, it's like, whoa, this person just talked to me. Yeah. Did it feel like that?
No. No, I didn't feel like that. No, I felt...
Maybe you were the cool one and you didn't realize.
I just felt secure, I was honestly 1 foot in high school and 1 foot out. Or 1 foot, wherever I was in school, I was 1 foot in, 1 foot out. Because I was mostly reading things on my own. Right. The one thing I guess I could say, I'll say this, right? Okay, one thing...
It's a family show.
Family show. Okay. I did well in school, okay, but I did well at an unusual level that I think may have put me in a special category that protected me against normal sort of sociopolitics, of school, quite honestly. Right. So, for example, I would get A's, okay, and I would get the highest grades in classes, like always, but I was almost always taken off the curve. You see, so I didn't inspire like people's sort of competitive. People didn't walk into a class and say, "Oh my God, we have to compete against him." It was never like that. In the sense that I was never like an academic threat to other people. So because I was just not on the curve, quite honestly. So and that maybe that saved me a little bit. I don't know, but so often...
I just want to interrupt because I want to bring it to the present a little bit for our audience to let them know who you are now, because it's great to go back into your biography. First of all, this is not Gary Shandling. I want people to know. This is not Gary Shandling.
He looks side of me like the public has not encountered before.
This is Gary Shandling's long-lost twin. His long-lost twin
is the real Shandling. I've been
has surfaced
to reveal myself to the public, as I truly am, and now you're encountering.
Now I finally feel like Johnny Carson. I've always wanted to be Johnny Carson, and because
be on that show, but I thought maybe I would cure cancer, then I would be on the show. That was merited,
Because I want to just get our audience a sense, because I have a feeling Kim Kardashian is about to knock on the door any second, because there is a deal going in the works now. Can I say this? With the Kardashians.
We don't want to go crazy.
Well, we don't want to go too crazy with it, but this play has resonated with the public at a time Steven, you are a genius. This is a play at a
don't use that
time.
category.
Well,
In
I'm
fact,
going
I
to say
use
it.
that category in
Okay,
the play,
you're
right?
very humble, but listen.
No, but I don't even, like, I say at some point, because I'll hear that. I will hear that. But in the play, I make the comment that not even Einstein and Newton considered themselves geniuses. It's really an outsider's term. I mean, somebody might look at you and characterize you in that way, but really, that's not something that I don't even know what that means.
Well, I think that I think Donald Trump considers himself a genius.
And that's enough to invalidate, the claim. Quite honestly. No, it's like
genius words come.
Claudia's talking.
Average people can see what the
But-
genius
but-
person has all these qualifications that normal
Yeah.
people, let's say normal people,
I mean,
don't have.
yeah, it is an interesting, topic of conversation. But
Let's just say what Claudia just said. Claudia just spoke. Claudia hardly ever speaks on the show, but now she wanted to say. What she said. What did you say again, Claudia?
The average people, we can
Average people.
we can see in the genius these qualities that
Yes.
we average people
Oh.
normally don't
Yeah,
see.
yeah.
That's why we call them genius,
Yes.
because we see they have special gifts.
Yes.
People have special gifts that often are not famous.
And the person that might have those gifts doesn't see them as gifts. I mean, it was interesting when Newton was asked, "How do you get these results? Where do your results come from?"
Yeah.
And his answer was not, "I'm a genius." His answer was, "I'm always thinking, by always thinking on them." That's what it is. I mean, when I was younger, if I thought that there was something different about my mind, it was one basic thing that I kind of identified, which was I had the ability to concentrate. I could focus, and that might like when you talk to Einstein about his abilities, he always talked about how difficult mathematics was for him. How much of a challenge it was, and usually it's a matter of, like in the case of somebody like an Einstein, works gestating over a long period of time. Like in the late 19th century, they were interested in the phenomenon of genius. I mean, they have, historically, for a long time. But one of the characterizations that I sort of like is, in general, intelligence, passion, and power of working. In other words, you have to have a certain level of intelligence, to be creative and to manipulate things and put them in new combinations, right? But you really have to have a passionate commitment to something. And that passionate commitment has to take the form of a persistent application, to produce, result after result after result. That even somebody like one of our clearest, archetypal geniuses is Mozart. And yet, Mozart was composing from a young age, maybe 4, maybe 5, maybe 3, elementary forms. But even so, it wasn't until he had been composing for 20 years at that level that he began to produce the sort of works for which he's remembered. Yes. If Mozart had died at 25, we might know the name, but barely. It wasn't until he was, from 25 and even 27 to 30 to 32 to 33 that he produced works of the highest level of art. That really has enshrined his name. So it's a long process of gestation and development that's sustained by a passionate commitment. What engages you.
And that's all true. It's all true, Stephen, and your passion is amazing and wonderful, and we love it. And but I'm just trying to also put this into perspective with the world that's out there, and the world in which we have global warming and climate change, and we have inequality of wealth, and we have poverty, and we have warfare, all of these terrible things in the world. Our show is about education, the arts, and social change, and combining all those things. One of the things that was really special for me about your play, Phalaris's Bull, solving the riddle of the great big world at the Beckett Theater, you up there giving a kind of a lecture, and an intellectual lecture with artwork behind you, telling the story of your life, weaving a narrative of your story with these important concepts and ideas. And I think it's important to know now that we have a crisis of intellect in our country, that there's a dumbing down. It's something we talk about on our show in the Academy, with people just focusing on studying business and profits and stuff. And how do we rekindle the intellectual life? if you read the New York Times, every, pundit worth their salt, including people like David Brooks, is talking about the loss of the humanities and how we're getting away from philosophy and literature. So here you are on now, this is off Broadway, the Beckett Theater.
Yes.
My question to you, and my question to Broadway, which has a range of work that's out there, but there's also a criticism of Broadway, and Frank Rich makes us aware of this. Frank Rich, who's a wonderful theater critic, and now he's a political commentator, has said this, that, criticizing the shallowness of a lot of the work that's being produced on Broadway. Do we need one more reality show turned into Broadway, theater? And of course, entertainment is good, but intellect and growth and learning, and go back to the ancient Greeks, and what is theater really all about? And now let's talk about one-man shows. One-man shows, you go back to the early monologues of the Greek philosophers, right up through Hal Holbrook had a wonderful thing on Mark Twain, and now we have, Mr. Steven Friedman, who has this incredible play. Talk about the play. I want our audience to get a sense of what this play is, what inspired you to write this play, and to become an actor.
Yes, which I am not. Yes. As everybody who saw the play can attest, I'm not an actor. No.
We need more non-actors.
Maybe. In fact, that was one of the ways it was going to be promoted. Like, what is this person with this intellectual background, this Harvard background, this background in philosophy, what is he doing in a one-man show on Broadway, almost pretending to be an actor, acting the part of an actor? What is this about? Well, it's partly my interest in broad communication. I feel that, philosophy is a field that has always had a relatively narrow appeal. Even in the 16th century, when modern philosophy was developing, Descartes, the first great figure of modern philosophy, a Frenchman, was born into a wealthy family, had an estate. Okay, he sold his estate, so he wouldn't have to be able to have to focus on supporting himself doing philosophy. Even then, it wasn't possible. Okay, so it's never had like a broad audience and a broad audience appeal. On the other hand, it's probably the most powerful intellectual force that's ever been formulated, in the sense that when modern physics was being created, when quantum mechanics was being formulated by Niels Bohr, for example, he published the original papers on the quantum the quantum representation of the hydrogen atom in the Journal of Philosophy. Okay, that's where these things were published. When Einstein died, on his desk, which was cluttered with 100 things at least, there's only one word you can clearly read, and that's philosophy. Okay? Now,
Wow.
it turns...
Can I just interrupt and say that Einstein was also a socialist, and a guy named Bernie Sanders is running for president now, who calls himself a socialist, and all people say, oh, it's a socialist. But we have people like Einstein was a socialist, H.G. Wells was a socialist. So just to say that.
Yeah. But so in general, when people ask me, like, what's the power of philosophy? Yes. It created science. If science has power, its power goes back to the philosophers, the empiricists, people of, the John Locke and Francis Bacon, Francis Bacon.
Rousseau, was he a philosopher? Rousseau, right?
Rousseau was, he was a philosopher, kind of...
state of nature, right?
State of nature, not involved in the creation of science per se, but involved in sort of the flowering of the Enlightenment, that was the dissemination of scientific ideas into broader culture.
Would you have been at home in the Enlightenment, Stephen? Would you have been in those coffee houses, chatting with Voltaire?
I would have liked to have known Voltaire. Voltaire is one of those few people historically that I think I would have liked to have communed with.
Can we recreate the Enlightenment right now?
Well, I mean, there have been efforts to do that, and I don't know, but it's like what I like to tell people is that the United States is obviously done well in terms of the development of modern science. It has the majority now of Nobel laureates. More Nobel laureates have been American than I think of any other nationality. It's certainly been true since the early 1930s, when, with the rise of Hitler, a lot of scientists left Germany came to the United States. Up until that point, Germany had the majority of Nobel laureates.
Really?
Since then, the United States.
Well, I think the university structure as we know it came about in Germany.
That's certainly an influential factor.
And Goethe was one of the great thinkers.
one of the great-
He was like you, I think. He was a scientist and a philosopher.
He was. And he's somebody that I've sometimes been compared to, and I do identify with Goethe, and there's a lot of his work that I respect, not so much in science, but in poetry, and his Faust has been an influence on me.
Picture him doing a one-man show.
He could easily have done a one-man show, and he was very gifted in theater.
You are the heir to Goethe,
Oh, that's flattering, but
who we discovered, folks.
but
Do you think Kim Kardashian will be impressed by that?
I think, I've discovered that when people are exposed to things that they might otherwise not have had a full appreciation for, the depth of appreciation is often much greater than you might imagine.
We shouldn't be snobs, in other words.
Absolutely not. I mean, the people, there are people that I've helped, that I've tutored. Tutoring is one of the ways I've supported myself, and one of the things that's kind of advanced my intellectual life, right? And I've helped people that weren't gifted academically. They struggled. If you had to kind of place them on a career course, you wouldn't necessarily even direct them to college. That it wouldn't seem that they would flourish in a college environment, or that it was suited to their temperament or their interests, their cognition. But in every instance, when such a person has gone through college, the benefits to that person have been conspicuous and enormous, and their world expands. I mean, if I had to give a carte blanche recommendation, to the country, to the population, I would say, no matter what, go to college. No matter what, expose yourself, to those additional years of intellectual maturation, where you will see the world fundamentally differently than you would ever have been able to, without that kind of additional degree of intellectual maturation and sophistication that you achieve. I find it indispensable for everybody, no matter what their, sort of fundamental interests are, or leanings, or career aspirations. I've seen it over and over again make the world of difference in what a person is able to appreciate, respond to, understand, enjoy. It just adds a whole dimension to the understanding and appreciation of life, of the living experience. So I think it's.
And regardless if people are doing white-collar work or blue-collar work, one of the things that we talk about on our show is the need for a shorter work week. Okay. If we had a shorter work week and people had more free time, then all kinds of folks could devote a certain number of hours per week to reading, to writing if they want to, or to getting together and discussing things with other people, to learning. We like to see our TV show as a kind of university. Just to have you on right here, to have this dialogue. This is going to wind up on YouTube, so people can say, hey, there are deficiencies in people's educations, including mine, including yours, including Mr. Trump's, that if you have a curious mind, you say, there are things I want to read. And that's what from your play, I that was my takeaway.
And one of the things, like I always found myself, a lot of my education has been self-education, okay? And a lot of it's been motivated by the following attitude that has proven just enormously helpful in motivating me in all different kinds of directions. I remember when I was, 15, 16, I didn't have much exposure to classical music, right? But I had heard about people like Mozart and Beethoven, and I began to get curious. And I said to myself, there may be something there, It's like these people have a reputation, they're honored, they're admired, they're acclaimed. Maybe the people doing, that acclaiming are seeing something that I'm not yet seeing or exposed to. So, and I've said this encountering field after field after field. If there's an institution out there, if there are people being celebrated for some kind of work, maybe I'm going to be able to understand and appreciate those individuals. So what I did was I was in Los Angeles. There was a classical radio station. My parents had bought me the classic version of the Britannica, which was like one of the amazing collections of writings where it wasn't Britannica by committee. Like all of the articles were written by experts in their field, and they entered the Britannica unedited. Okay, so it was an amazing collection of writings. But I would listen to this classical radio station. A piece by Mozart would be played, and I go to the Britannica and read about Mozart. And then a piece by Schubert would be played.
Educated yourself.
And over the course of maybe 4 or 5 months, I had familiarized myself with a lot of classical music, and I began to develop appreciations. I began to develop preferences, But the beginning of that process was the faith that maybe if there's this institution of classical music that's so celebrated, there might be something in it that I can come to appreciate.
Right.
Now, and I've done that over and over again with artists, with writer.
Who are some of your favorite writers? Let's just say in terms of literature. Do you have favorite novelists?
Yeah, like my philosophical career began a little bit around the time of when I started reading Camus. So he was like one of the first authors that I read basically all the works of.
The Plague, The Stranger.
The Stranger, The Myth of Sisyphus, The Rebel. Yes, exactly.
He was one of the great existentialist thinkers.
Writers, and a man of profound humanity. Like he once said that there is in his makeup something that would like to create works of great beauty, but there's also an even stronger impulse to give a voice to people that don't have that voice themselves. To sort of like speak out for some of the brutalities and some of the the unfortunates of the human condition. So
there's a line
like writing was as much political as aesthetic, and I've always respected that impulse. So somebody like Dostoevsky, was
I love him.
Was like a major figure. We were talking, but. I'll tell you one, just to give you an example of how like one's self-education progresses. I had been interested, I was mentioning, in science and math, and then philosophy, right? Which was, mostly throughout high school, I was reading philosophy. Okay, I was not reading literature. But then my mother was English, and we had a lot of family in England. So periodically, I'd go across to England to spend, maybe it was a week, maybe 3 weeks, maybe at one time 3 months.
Across the big pond.
Across the big pond. And I went once for a 3-month stay. The first week, I was staying with an uncle of mine, and I remember opening. They got magazines, so I opened a random magazine, a British magazine. I was just kind of going through the magazine, and I opened it to a page happened to have a perfume ad. Okay, now in England. In those days, this is like 30, 40 years ago, I don't know, maybe it's still true, a lot of the ads were illustrated by quotations from great English writers. The most commonly Shakespeare, and then Samuel Johnson was commonly quoted, and then other writers. It was a sort of a common format.
Jane Austen, maybe.
Jane Austen, probably. Okay. I opened this perfume ad, and there was a quotation from Shakespeare's King Lear. Her voice was ever soft, gentle, and low, an excellent thing in woman. I read that quote, which I had never encountered before. I hadn't read Lear. I hadn't read much Shakespeare. And the Shakespeare I'd read was stuff that had been assigned in high school. I'd read Romeo and Juliet and Julius Caesar, and maybe that was it. And maybe A Midsummer Night's Dream. That was all the Shakespeare I read. Well, I read that line in that perfume ad, and it struck me as the most beautiful thing I'd ever read. And it gave me chills. To such a degree that the next day, I went to Foyle's, which was this famous bookstore. I don't know, I think it closed not too many years ago, but at one time it was like one of the world's largest bookstores, and it was celebrated as a place you can go to get anything. Right. So I went to Foyle's, and I got King Lear, okay, and I read it. And I proceeded from that point on to read through all of Shakespeare. In fact, if I were to give a recommendation to somebody, just in terms of like one's self-education, don't even begin to contemplate the process of writing until you've read every word of Shakespeare, every play of Shakespeare.
That's
yes.
it. Homework assignment, folks, from Steven. Get to work. Get to work.
Read a play a week, and in the next, like 3/4 of a year, you'll have read through all of Shakespeare.
But there's one annoying thing about Shakespeare. I want to say this, okay? And I love Shakespeare too. Now, when you're reading Shakespeare and you have to keep going down to define the words,
you don't have to.
You don't have to.
No,
okay.
You don't have to. Once you read Shakespeare enough, you will discover that he reads almost like the newspaper, in the sense that what Shakespeare did is he fixed the language. Like if you look at English like prior to Shakespeare, like 250 years before Shakespeare was Chaucer. Chaucer was writing in Middle English. You cannot really read Chaucer easily. I can't read Chaucer easily. Right. You have to have studied Chaucer. For that, Chaucer is often published now in translated versions, where you're reading a modern English of Chaucer, or you're reading modern English, on a facing page to the actual original Chaucer. Okay, we can't read Chaucer easily. That's Middle English. Shakespeare, on the other hand, it is the cause. It is the cause, my soul. Let me not name it to you, you chaste stars. It is the cause. Yet I'll not shed her blood, nor scar that whiter skin of hers than snow, and smooth as monumental alabaster. Yet she must die, else she'll betray more men. Put out the light, and then put out the light. I mean, there's not a word there that we don't understand. Yeah. And there's not a syntactical form that's not contemporary with us. Shakespeare was 400 years ago. The question is, why did the language change so much in the 250 years from Chaucer to Shakespeare? But from Shakespeare to the present, if you read Shakespeare enough, he can read like contemporary English. If you read him, like I've just recited him. It's because Shakespeare's importance to the language was so overwhelming that Shakespearean English became really English. And so we are never going to be deviating that much from the syntactical, the basic forms of Shakespeare. And a lot of the...
You would love, I want to just say, one of our former guests on our show was Professor James Shapiro at Columbia University, who wrote a book called Shakespeare in America, which Bill Clinton wrote the foreword to. And he's just a delightful man. And he's I'm just thinking in the future we could get you guys on a salon or something like that. But as far as Shakespeare, I want to tell you one of my favorite quotes was from As You Like It. And I'm trying to remember, there was a male character who was called over to talk to this woman, and he was very shy. And you were talking to me about shyness, and I'm also a recovering shy person. I often say this on the air, and this TV show helps a lot, believe me. But there was a character who was called over to talk to a woman, and he felt shy, and he said, because he really had a crush on this woman, and because he had a crush on her, he was very afraid to talk to her. And he said to her, he says, "Oh, what passion hangs these weights upon my tongue. I cannot speak to her, though she urged conference." And I thought, what a beautiful way of saying, I'm afraid to talk to her because I'm shy, because I'm in love with her.
Yes, there's incredible beauty, moment to moment. And just what it came to my mind when you were saying this, one of the most beautiful, the most penetrating things ever said about Shakespeare. It came to my mind, so I'm going to offer it up.
It's a good conversation. This is what happens, folks.
This is what happens.
Turn off the TV. Turn off the TV when the show is over. Though.
So one of my favorite writers, one of the people that most influenced my style, was John Berryman. John Berryman was a 20th century poet and essayist and literary critic. There's a book of essays that I recommend enormously, one of my favorite works, The Freedom of the Poet, that was published posthumously. It contains a vast collection of writings on not just specific literary works, but with glosses on the nature of American culture and literary culture, intellectual aspiration, what the difference between art and entertainment, for example, things of that sort. That for ideas that one comment that he makes at one point, and I think he's quoting or referring to T.S. Eliot, something T.S. Eliot wrote, that art is not fundamentally a self-expression; it's fundamentally a self-discipline. Which is something that I find true in all of my creative work, that maybe the first image that I paint might have to do with something I've experienced that day, something I've seen, something that's been on my mind, some emotionality. But once the first image is set, the rest of the work is done in relation to the demands of that first image.
Can people see this, by the way? And what is this called, Stephen?
These are, I call them poles. and they're acrylic under acrylic. So these are acrylic rods, clear acrylic rods. They are painted in acrylic paint, but on the reverse. And each each of what you see here are individual brushstrokes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 individual brushstrokes. The paint is organized on the brush and applied to the pole in a single gesture. The nature of that gesture and the nature of how the paint is mixed and what I've applied and how I've applied it to the brush determines the actual result of the brushstroke. And you're seeing basically a brushstroke that's being magnified by the poles, and also where light is being concentrated by the poles to give you different optical effects. Wow. And each one basically is a painting in and of itself, almost a world in and of itself. And the poles become, as a summation of these worlds, almost a kind of a universal totem. And they're precise in the sense that it's a series of just discrete applications of paint, to the pole, but those very sort of uncomplicated applications produce this enormous visual richness of effect.
So I'm getting a sense from you now, Steven, that in terms of being a Renaissance man, you really are accomplished in many, many different fields.
And there's something to be said about that. And there are two ways that one can work in a variety of fields. One is to be a dilettante, which is you do a little bit of work here, do a little bit of work there, but without any real depth and commitment.
Jack of all trades, master of none.
Yes.
Okay.
When I do art, I am doing it only and purely as an artist. I am not thinking of myself as a philosopher who is illustrating philosophy in paint. When I write poetry, I'm not doing it as a philosopher who's trying to communicate metrically in poems. I mean, a lot of philosophers or people on the borderline of philosophy, people like Thoreau, Emerson, would write poetry, but you got the feeling that their poems were meant to be sort of vehicles for expressing philosophical ideas often. I don't do that. When I'm writing, for me, a poem is largely a metrical creation. It's governed by the sound of the words. And when I'm writing poetry, the poems will come to me. And they'll come to me like in an initial line that establishes the metrical pattern and the imagery. And again, like I said with the poles, that line then dictates the rest of the flow of the poem. So, but the terms of creation of the poem are sound and meter and image, not idea, not abstract idea. When I'm writing aphorisms also will come to me. They will come to me, in the finished form of these concentrated statements that I write. The riddle of the world is an object. The meaning of the world is its most general representation. Those concentrated forms sort of emerge as pure ideas. There's very little connection between how I write philosophy and how I write poetry and how I do painting, in the sense that when I'm doing each one, I'm doing it as if that were the only activity I'm doing. The one will certainly infuse the other. I mean, the art will be somewhat infused by the nature of my philosophical considerations, but it's not meant to be an illustration of it.
Steven, you talked about how a work can be both artistic and also entertaining at the same time. Now, earlier you and I were we're having a wonderful since we got here to this building. We've been talking. It's been a feast of language.
The best of what we've discussed is not on film.
And I'll tell you something. This is a guy who ought to be at any major dinner party on either coast. I mean, you should be in demand.
I am actually kind of good at dinner parties. I don't like dinner parties. No. But I am good at them. The problem is I have to make sure I eat before I go to the dinner party. Because once I go to the dinner party, I do not eat. I'm given food and I just sit there and talk. And until I am asked to be quiet. Okay, Steven, would you please? We've heard enough.
I got to be honest now. I have a good friend, and I have a friend who lives in Hoboken. We live in Hoboken, Claudia and I. He's a friend of mine. He's been coaching me. He'll see me on the street, and he'll say, John, I saw you on the show, and you let that person do all the talking. You got to get in there. You got to make sure that they know. And I say, wait a minute, with Steven, that's going to be a tough thing.
It's hard. And
I apologize to my friend in Hoboken if he sees me. But I love to hear you, though. You're really interesting.
It's very
Claudia said it's good.
It's good. It's good. I mean,
You don't want to hear me, right, Claudia? She's tired. She hears enough of me at home.
no, we were talking about the anecdote before. We met during a question and answer, right?
Yes.
At the end of...
At the Beckett Theater.
Yes.
There was a 20-minute talkback after the play,
Yes, it was the
which was
first-
supposed to be an
Yes.
open format,
Yes.
but
I go out, and this was the first one we were doing. I had been doing them informally up until then. I was like going out. When I first was doing the play, I was just staying in my dressing room until everybody left, and I was going home. Okay, but then I was getting requests, to go out and talk to people. Okay, so I didn't mind at all. I kind of enjoy that. So, especially because it's off script, and I like to be off script. So I would go out, and in the lounge area, or the lobby area after the play, I would, there might be half a dozen people or whatever, and I would talk to them about the play, and they would ask me questions, and I would, amplify on different aspects of it. Fine. But then the requests continued until the people, involved in, the play, the production itself, wanted to have a more formal question and answer. Okay, so the one you attended was the first.
okay. An experiment.
It was an experiment, yes, and it was done in the theater where, and because everybody involved in staying after had to be paid, there were time limitations, and people, some of the people that worked on the play would be at the theater all day, and they'd have to be at the performance at night, and they would want to go home at some reasonable hour,
Right.
So there was technically imposed upon me a strict 20-minute limit, for the question and answer. Okay, so I go outside, and I go out onto the stage,
Yes.
and there were right after the performance, and there were maybe 20 people, 25 people in the question and answer. You were there, yeah. And I didn't, since I hadn't done that before, I didn't exactly know the direction that might be most desirable, but
You had so much more you wanted to say.
I had a lot to say. So
So I was off to the races.
So I asked the audience, I asked the people that were there, like, would you like to ask me questions, or would you like me to amplify myself on a few things? And I think it was unanimous.
I think we wanted to hear more from you. I think that was also...
Yeah, so I was asked, just talk. So I talked, and 16 minutes later, I think I was stopped by somebody, that was on our staff, right, who said, okay, you've got to take some questions, Steven, which became a question, and John had the honor of the question.
Well, here's the problem. Here's the thing. Now, Claudia knows when we go to these things, she knows I'm like always get in there, the Q&A. I have things to say.
Yes.
And I felt that burning need to speak as well. And yet, you were so fascinating that I was just enjoying listening. And I felt like, okay, I could deal with this,
It's partly that there's a lot more to say than was in the play. And in fact, in the construction of the play, I was working with a director, a well-known director, David Schweizer, who's a highly experienced director. He was brought in partly because I had no experience doing this, and he did have a tradition of working with people that were doing one-man shows for the first time, aside from other sophisticated productions he was involved in, and he was always kind of outside the box in terms of trying to reach for something new, theatrically. So he became my director, and we would have these rehearsal sessions. And at the beginning of every session, just to kind of sort of break the ice, and get us into the mood, of the rehearsal, I would usually tell an anecdote, whatever was on my mind. This became, like a daily sort of format. And the annoying thing was that every time I would tell an anecdote, David's reaction would be, that needs to be in the play.
Put it in.
Put it in the play. Put it in the play. Actually, the way the play opens, that reference to Phalaris's bull, was not in the original script. It was an anecdote that I told, one of these afternoons that David liked so much that he said, "Can you please write that up and let us?" And that not only became the opening of the play, but it became the title of the play. So that
how the artistic process works.
And I found that that's often how I like to work, in some organic way, not something that's contrived or forced. An author, you might like this author, but an author that is often contrived and forced is Freud. actually. You get the sense reading Freud that, he has a problem and he's going to think of something that accounts, for this syndrome, even if he has to force it. It's not always an organic process of discovery and creation, which is more, the manner of thinking and creation that I am engaged in.
Right, and the organic is this thinking outside the box.
And also letting things come to you in a natural period of gestation. So the problem might be in my mind. There might be a certain problem in my mind that I'm considering. It might be a philosophical problem. It might be an artistic problem. And rather than rushing to a solution, I will let the solution come to me. Maybe in the course of a night. Maybe in the course of a week. But whatever it takes. And once it presents itself in sort of a natural kind of formulation, then it's something that I can really seize upon and go with.
Wow.
Yeah.
Claudia just gave us the 10 minute, and I can't believe how quickly this went, this hour. It's been amazing.
And we've been talking for literally 2 hours almost, right? Yeah, seriously.
And I can go on and on, but listen to me now, Steven. I would love it for the precious time that we have left, okay? I would like to talk about two things with you. One, because I am also someone interested in writing a one-man show for myself, and I've been thinking about my life as a one-man show.
My recommendation is do not ever do a one-man show. No.
Okay, no. But here's...
I am still struggling to recover my voice, from the experience.
But let me tell you, my friend,
That's a joke.
Okay. But meeting you has reaffirmed my theory that my life must be a one-man show, because look who I met. I met a guy who's got the best one-man show now, a show that Chaz Palminteri has shown an interest in. Chaz Palminteri is one of my heroes. The Bronx Tale, I think, is one of the best movies ever, with Robert De Niro. And this guy wrote it from his own life experiences growing up in the Bronx, writing about people he knew, the guy on the corner, the guy in the bar, the mafia guys, and he has their language and lingo down. He started that movie originally was a one-man show on Broadway.
And he still does that one-man show. And in fact, my producer knows Chaz Palminteri. And that was one of the reasons why Chaz came, to the performance. And it was actually my producer's connection with Chaz is probably one of the reasons for the ultimate inception of this play. That, I'd been giving a lecture, actually. I was wanting to make my philosophical results more broadly public. And I was represented by a gallery. I am represented by a gallery in Los Angeles, Robert Berman Gallery. The dealer, aside from showing my polls and my art, became a little bit of a fan. Okay. So that when for the last number of years now, 5-6 years, whenever I would go into the gallery, he would immediately get his video camera and start recording me. He was interested in what I had to say. Okay, wow. So he became a fan of just whatever would happen to be on my mind. So when it became a matter of what would be a reasonable venue for me to give a talk, and maybe a talk that could be illustrated by art or other media, I went to Robert and he said, "Sure, love to do it." So it was a rainy night. It was like one of these LA downpours, deluges. Shortly before I was scheduled to begin, which was basically an unscripted lecture that would be about the philosophy and about its different sources, some of the main ideas, and some of its applications in different fields, like molecular biology. Also, part of it was also going to be about 20 minutes of poetry, narrative poetry from a narrative poem, a long narrative poem I had written, autobiographical, giving a poetic version, of my intellectual development. As the time to begin had arrived, there were like 7 people in the gallery because the weather was so inclement. Half an hour later, we waited. We had to start. It was standing room only. Oh my God. And one of the people, I went on for 2.5 hours, talking.
Just off the top? Unscripted. Amazing.
20 minutes of poetry, that I recited.
Right.
And it was a little bit unwieldy, but still, it got a very strong, enthusiastic reaction, including from this producer, Al Corley, who was present. He was impressed. He felt that maybe it needed to be structured a little more, maybe, like, concentrated, maybe scripted.
Right.
We had a talk about that.
Sure.
I was going to do a follow-up talk a few weeks later at a private home of some friends of mine in Malibu, actually.
Okay.
For that, I prepared a 1-hour version of what had been, a 2.5-hour, impromptu presentation. I met with Al, the eventual producer, shortly, a few days before I was to give the Malibu talk. In his car, because it was getting late, we didn't have time to go back to his house. In his car, I start reciting the scripted form, of what's going to be this 1-hour presentation. About 20 minutes in, I see for the first time in my life somebody experience the light bulb phenomenon. A light bulb going.
Saw that bulb.
I saw the bulb go off in his head.
Oh
and,
my God.
And the next words out of his mouth was, Broadway. We have to do this as a theatrical piece. It has to be not a lecture.
Right.
It has to transcend the lecture format.
Right.
It has to involve art. You're an artist. It has to involve science. It has to involve, music. It has to be a whole sort of theatrical presentation, not just something, as one-dimensional as a lecture. And I remember saying to him, okay, I know you're busy. I know you have lots of projects. He was a film producer.
Right.
And I said, is there enough in this for you to be committed, to its fulfillment?
Right.
And he was absolutely.
Amazing.
And he was true to his word.
Wow.
And about a year later, it was
Amazing.
at the Beckett Theater.
We are so delighted to have you here. This is a feast of ideas and excitement and hope and creativity that we have here. And we only have about 2 minutes left, but tell us now, what is next? You have some clear openings. One involves Kim Kardashian. One involves the Whitney Museum. Quickly.
Yes. The play was filmed,
Yeah.
and it's being made into a filmed version that museums are now interested in. We've gotten some positive feedback from MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art. I just heard from the Whitney. The Metropolitan seems to have expressed interest. So we have to obviously. That has to be edited. It was filmed in 3 cameras, so it'll be edited into a film version of the play and then submitted to those institutions. There is a reality show that's being discussed that would allow me to be even, more directly communicative with an audience, which is my fundamental interest. There's a documentary film, being considered. There's a whole series of projects, including the remounting of the play, and maybe back to New York in the spring, or possibly on tour, different parts of the world.
What about at a big show house like the Schubert Theater or the Nederlander or one of those big show houses?
That would be desirable. I would love that. I mean, the broader the venue, the larger the audience. I think the more opportunity there is to just disseminate ideas that have a life and a vitality and a broad benefit.
What about the Barrymore Theater? We're friends with one of John Barrymore's relatives, actually. So maybe we can put a word in.
Yes. And I mean, I want to keep performing it. I mean, I enjoyed the experience. It was my first time on the stage, but I enjoyed the communication so much that it's something that no matter what else I do, I want that to be among the projects that we pursue.
You're a wonderful man. You're a great inspiration, and it's such a delight to meet you and get to know you here and to have you as a guest on our show. You're always welcome back, and good luck with the play.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Okay.
I really appreciate it.
Thank you.